The final word from her brother-in-law, Thomas Davies, was delivered not with sympathy, but with the cold finality of a hammer striking an anvil. Eleanor stood on the porch of the home she had shared with his brother, a home now legally and spiritually his. The funeral dirt was still under her fingernails. Her husband, barely a month in the ground. Thomas pressed a thin stack of bills and a folded, yellowed deed into her palm. His hand was clean, his grip firm and brief. "This is what is left," he said, his voice as flat as the prairie wind. $40, and the deed to the old Maw mine. It was James's folly. Now it is yours. He did not look her in the eye. Behind him, through the window, she could see his wife clearing the mantelpiece of the few things that had been hers. The community of Prosperity Gulch stood at a respectable distance, a silent chorus of witnesses to her dispossession. They saw a young widow, barely 20, being handed her walking papers. The deed was for a played-out silver claim, high in the granite teeth of the mountains, a place locals called the Devil's Maw. It was worthless. Everyone knew it. The shaft was collapsed, the air foul, the ground barren. It was a joke, a piece of land one used in a crooked card game. Giving it to her was not an act of charity. It was a final, dismissive insult. It was a way of sending her into the wilderness to die, but with the clean conscience of having given her something. She looked at the faces in the small crowd, pity in some, a cold satisfaction in others who had always seen her as an outsider who married above her station. Mr. Gable, the owner of the town mercantile, adjusted his spectacles and gave a slight, sad shake of his head, a practiced gesture of solemn disapproval that did nothing to hide his gossiping nature. He had already calculated her chances. They were 0. Eleanor did not cry. She did not plead. The grief for her husband was a cold, hard stone in her belly, and there was no room for any other weakness. She folded the deed carefully and tucked it into her pocket with the money. She turned away from the house, from the life that had been stolen from her, and walked toward the center of town. She had one companion left in the world, a scruffy, black-coated dog named Cinder, her husband's loyal shadow, who now trotted silently at her heels, his head low. Her first and only stop was Gable's Mercantile. The bell above the door chimed, a sound that suddenly felt alien and hostile. Mr. Gable was polishing the counter, but he stopped when he saw her. "Eleanor," he said, his tone dripping with a rehearsed commiseration. "A terrible business. If you need credit for a ticket east, to your family—" "I am not going east," she said. Her voice was quiet but clear, cutting through the dusty air of the store. "I need an axe, a good one, a felling axe, and a shovel." Gable stared at her, his mouth slightly agape. An axe? A shovel? The whole town knew what she'd been given. Such tools were useless for the Maw. "And rope," she added, 50 feet, and a sack of flour, salt, and beans. He weighed her request, his eyes flicking from her determined face to the purse where she kept the $40. He was doing the math. This was not the behavior of a woman seeking charity. This was the behavior of someone making a stand on impossible ground. He saw it as foolishness, a final act of defiance before the inevitable, a story he could tell for weeks. "For the Maw?" he asked, unable to keep the disbelief from his voice. "The land is mine," she replied, her voice unwavering. She placed the coins on the counter. The sound was sharp, definitive. She bought the tools, the food, a heavy wool blanket, and a tinderbox. With her remaining few dollars, she bought a small cast-iron pot. Her purchases left her with nothing but a few pennies. She strapped the supplies to her back, the weight a punishing but real comfort. It was something she owned, something no one could take away. As she left, Mr. Gable followed her to the door. "The wolves get hungry up there, girl," he called after her. "That land will break you." Eleanor did not look back. With Cinder at her side, she turned her back on Prosperity Gulch and began the long walk toward the mountains, toward the worthless inheritance that was now her entire world. The journey was a pilgrimage into purgatory. The trail that wound up toward the Devil's Maw was little more than a goat path, choked with scree and thorny brush. The weight of the axe, shovel, and supplies dug into her shoulders, a constant grinding pain that matched the ache in her heart. Each step took her further from the world of people and deeper into a silence broken only by the wind whistling through pine and rock. Cinder stayed close, a warm, panting presence in the vast, indifferent wilderness. For 2 days she walked, sleeping under the cold watch of the stars, wrapped in her single blanket. The landscape grew harsher, more skeletal. The trees thinned, clinging to life in the cracks of the granite cliffs. The air grew thin and sharp. She was entering a world that did not want her, a place that had already defeated generations of harder men than she could ever hope to be. She found it at dusk on the second day, the Devil's Maw. It was worse than the stories. A jagged gash in the face of the mountain, a dark, frowning mouth of shattered rock and splintered, sun-bleached timbers. The main entrance had collapsed decades ago, leaving a treacherous pit of rubble and debris. A foul, stagnant air seemed to leak from its depths. It was a tomb. Mr. Gable had been right. Thomas Davies had sent her here to fail. For a long moment, Eleanor stood there, the full weight of her situation crashing down on her. The exhaustion, the grief, the utter hopelessness of it all. Her knees felt weak. Tears, hot and sharp, finally burned at the back of her eyes. The town was right. The land was a curse. She had traded her last dollars for tools to dig her own grave. Cinder whined softly, pressing his head against her leg, sensing the wave of despair that threatened to pull her under. She sank to the ground, her face in her hands, the rough bark of a dead pine scraping her cheek. The cold of the coming night began to seep into her bones. It was the dog that saved her. Cinder, restless and agitated, began to sniff and paw at a narrow fissure in the rock face, a few yards to the side of the main collapsed entrance. It was almost completely hidden by a thick growth of hardy, wind-stunted juniper. He pushed his nose into the crack, then looked back at her and barked, a sharp, insistent sound. Annoyed at first, Eleanor pushed herself to her feet, her muscles screaming in protest, and went to pull him away. As she reached the fissure, she felt it, a faint but undeniable current of air flowing out of the crack in the rock. And it was not cold, it was mild, almost warm, a deep, earthy warmth, like the breath of a sleeping animal. It carried no foul smell, only the clean scent of damp stone and deep earth. Holding her breath, she pressed her ear to the rock. From the darkness within, she heard a sound, a slow, steady, rhythmic drip, drip, drip. Water. Hope, fierce and desperate, surged through her like a fever. This was the secret. This was the advantage no one in town knew about. The mine was not dead. Deep inside, the earth itself was breathing. Geothermal warmth, a spring. The main entrance was a wreck, a lost cause. But this fissure, this was a door. It was small, choked with roots and fallen rock, but it was a way in. Despair transformed into a grim, cold resolve. She unstrapped the axe from her back. Her hands were raw, her body was screaming for rest, but she had found her beginning. The town was wrong. This land would not break her. She would make it her own. The work began with the rising sun and ended long after it had set, in a darkness lit only by a meager fire. The first task was widening the fissure. With the shovel in her bare hands, she dug away the soil and rock that choked the opening. Her hands, soft from a life of domesticity, were shredded within the first hour. Blisters formed, broke, and bled, leaving raw, weeping patches of skin. She ignored the pain, wrapping her palms in strips torn from her petticoat. The rhythm of the work became her world, the scrape of the shovel against stone, the groan of a dislodged rock, the tearing of stubborn roots. After 2 days of relentless labor, the opening was large enough to squeeze through. Inside, the air was still and warm, the darkness absolute. Lighting a small bundle of pine splinters, she saw a narrow, sloping tunnel, barely tall enough to stand in. The walls were solid granite, and the floor was a gentle, even slope of packed earth. The steady drip of water she had heard was louder now, echoing from somewhere deeper in the mine. This was not a collapsed death trap. It was a stable, protected space. Her next task was shelter. She would not live in the darkness like an animal. She would build a small cabin, a lean-to, against the face of the mountain, using the widened fissure as its back door. This would be her great room, her connection to the sun and sky. The mine itself would be her cellar, her larder, her refuge from the true cold. For weeks, she felled the tough, resilient pines that grew in the more sheltered hollows of the mountain. The axe, at first an unwieldy and terrifying weight, slowly became an extension of her arms. She learned the bite of the blade, the geometry of the notch, the satisfying crack and shudder of a falling tree. Getting the logs to her building site was a brutal ordeal. She had no horse, no mule. She used the rope, her own body, and sheer, stubborn will. She learned to use the terrain, rolling logs down slopes, levering them over obstacles. Her muscles burned with a fire that never seemed to go out. She grew leaner, harder. The soft lines of her face sharpened, her gaze becoming direct and unflinching. She was being remade by the mountain, carved into something new by the demands of her own survival. She laid a foundation of flat stones, hauled one by one from a nearby rock slide. She notched the logs with painstaking precision, fitting them together to form 3 solid walls. The 4th wall was the mountain itself. For the roof, she laid smaller logs and covered them with layers of pine boughs, sod, and a thick coating of clay she found near the spring inside the mine. She mixed the clay with dry grass to make a crude but effective daub, using it to chink the gaps between the logs. Every completed task was a quiet, solitary triumph. The first wall standing, the roof holding back the rain. The day she hung a door made from planks split with wedges and the back of her axe. With the main shelter established, she turned her attention to the interconnected systems that would keep her alive. The spring was her first priority. She followed the sound of dripping water deep into the mine, to a place where a clean, clear seep emerged from a crack in the granite wall. The water was cool and pure. Using her shovel, she hollowed out a basin in the earth beneath it, then spent a week lining it with the same sticky clay she had used for her roof, packing it down until it was watertight. She had created a cistern, a reservoir of fresh water deep underground, where it would never freeze. Her next system was heat. She built a fireplace and chimney from carefully selected stones, mortared together with more clay. The hearth was the heart of her small cabin, but she knew it would not be enough to fight the deep winter. The mine's geothermal warmth was her true advantage. She cleared a larger area just inside the entrance, a kind of subterranean antechamber. This space held a steady, mild temperature, never truly hot, but never freezing. It was here she would store her food and firewood, keeping it dry and accessible. She devised a simple but ingenious ventilation system. A small, secondary fissure high up on the mountain acted as a natural chimney. By clearing a narrow channel connecting it to her living space, she could draw the smoke from her fire away, and the constant, gentle draft kept the air in the mine from becoming stagnant. But shelter and warmth were not enough. She needed a sustainable source of food beyond the beans and flour she had carried with her. Hunting small game provided some meat, but it was unreliable. She needed something that would produce. This led to her most audacious plan, the one that would cement her reputation as a fool in the eyes of Prosperity Gulch. She needed livestock. After nearly 2 months of ceaseless labor, she made the journey back down the mountain. She walked into Gable's mercantile, a different woman. Her clothes were patched and stained with dirt and pine pitch. Her hands were calloused, her face browned by the sun and wind. But her eyes held a new light, a quiet confidence that unsettled the men who loafed by the stove. Mr. Gable stared at her as if she were a ghost. "I need to buy 2 goats," she said, her voice raspy from disuse. "A nanny and a kid, and half a dozen chickens." A silence fell over the store. Gable broke it with a short, incredulous laugh. "Goats? Up at the maw? Girl, what in God's name for? There's no pasture. The wolves will have them before the first snow." "I have a place for them," she said simply. "A barn." The men exchanged glances. A barn? On that god-forsaken rock pile? They thought she had lost her mind. The isolation had finally cracked her. Gable, seeing no profit in arguing with a madwoman, sold her the animals at an inflated price. The sight of Eleanor leading 2 bleating goats and carrying a crate of squawking chickens through the main street of Prosperity Gulch became an instant legend. Children pointed. Women whispered behind their hands. The nickname was born that day, spoken first by Gable as he watched her leave. "There goes the goat girl of the maw," he chuckled, "feeding her flock to the mountain." The laughter followed her all the way to the edge of town. She did not care. She had her animals. The journey back up the mountain was even harder, coaxing the stubborn goats up the steep path, protecting the chickens. Cinder proved his worth, nipping at the goats' heels to keep them moving, his sharp barks warning away a curious coyote. Back at her homestead, she revealed her plan. Deep inside the mine, in a large cavern warmed by the earth's own heat, she had built a pen. She had hauled in sack after sack of dry leaves and grass for bedding. She had even hauled soil, rich loam, from a protected valley floor into the mine. By the faint light that filtered through a crack high above, and with the help of a lantern, she planted a small, strange garden of kale and hardy greens. It was a subterranean farm, protected from the wind, the snow, and the killing frost. The goats and chickens would live in the stable warmth of the earth, providing her with milk, eggs, and eventually, meat. Their waste would fertilize her small, miraculous garden. It was a closed, self-sustaining system, an ecosystem of one, born of desperation and ingenuity. As the first snows began to fall, Eleanor and her small flock were sealed in their fortress of stone, ready for the winter. The mockery from the town solidified into a kind of local folklore. The tale of the goat girl of the maw was told with amusement around the pot-bellied stove in Gable's mercantile. Trappers who passed near her claim reported seeing smoke rising from a crack in the rock, but no sign of a proper cabin, feeding the narrative that she was living in a hole like a badger. Mr. Gable was the chief storyteller, embellishing the tale with each telling. He described her as a wild thing, her mind broken by grief and solitude, tending a phantom herd in the bowels of the earth. The name stuck, a brand of pity and derision. Eleanor was oblivious to their stories, and would not have cared if she had heard them. Her world had shrunk to the rhythms of survival, a routine as steady and dependable as the mountain itself. Her days were governed by a simple, repeating liturgy of tasks. At dawn, she would rise in the small, sturdy cabin, the air crisp but not biting. The first order of business was always the fire in her stone hearth, its warmth a welcome blessing against the morning chill. With the fire fed and burning bright, she would take a lantern and cinder, and walk through the stone doorway into the mine. The transition was always a small miracle. She would leave behind the sound of the wind screaming over the peaks and enter a world of profound, warm silence. The air in the mine was still and mild, carrying the earthy scent of damp soil and livestock. Her goats would bleat a greeting from their pen, their breath misting in the lantern light. She would milk the nanny, her hands moving with practiced efficiency, the stream of warm milk hissing into the bucket. The chickens, nestled in their coop, would cluck and stir. Finding an egg in the nesting box was a daily gift, a small treasure of protein and fat. She tended her strange, subterranean garden with meticulous care. The kale and chard grew slowly but steadily in the dim light, their deep green leaves a startling splash of life against the gray rock. She watered them from the cistern, the water always clean, always flowing. The routine was the anchor of her sanity. Tending the fire, feeding the animals, watering the garden, mending her clothes by the firelight, checking the snares she set for rabbits at the edge of the tree line. It was a solitary existence, but it was not a lonely one. Cinder was her constant shadow, and the quiet presence of her animals filled the silence. Before the deep winter had fully set in, her systems faced their first real test. A pack of wolves, driven down from the high peaks by hunger, caught the scent of her goats. For 3 nights they circled her homestead, their howls echoing off the cliffs, a chilling symphony of wild hunger. The first night, she stood guard at the small, shuttered window of her cabin, her husband's old rifle in her hands, her heart pounding. Cinder stood beside her, a low, rumbling growl in his chest. But the wolves could find no way in. The cabin walls were thick logs and solid stone. The entrance to the mine was barricaded by a heavy door she had fashioned from rock and timber. They could smell the life within, but they could not reach it. By the 3rd night, they gave up and moved on, their hungry cries fading into the distance. Her fortress had held. The small victory filled her with a profound sense of security. She had built well. As the days shortened and the snows deepened, her world became even smaller. She was the sovereign of a tiny kingdom of warmth and life, carved out of the frozen heart of the mountain. Outside, the world was a maelstrom of white and gray, a place of brutal, killing cold. But inside her shelter, there was order. There was food. There was the steady, living warmth of the fire, the animals, and the earth itself. She was utterly alone, cut off from all humanity, but she was not helpless. She was surviving, on her own terms, in the place everyone had called worthless. The blizzard of '83 did not arrive. It descended. It fell out of a bruised, iron-gray sky like a judgment, a physical entity of ice and wind that declared war on the world of men. It began not with gentle flakes, but with a blinding sheet of white, driven by a wind that shrieked like a banshee. It was a storm beyond memory, a force of nature that clawed and battered and sought to erase every warm thing from the face of the earth. For Eleanor, the storm's arrival was a terrifying spectacle, but one she watched from a position of safety. Inside her cabin, the wind's scream was muffled to a low moan. The thick, sod-covered roof and the chinked log walls held fast against the onslaught. The stone of the mountain absorbed the wind's fury without a shudder. The real test was the cold. The temperature plummeted to a depth that could freeze a man's breath in his lungs, that made exposed wood crack and pop like gunfire. But inside her shelter, the double-layered defense of her fireplace and the mine's geothermal heat worked in perfect harmony. While the fire in the hearth roared, keeping the cabin livable, the steady, gentle warmth flowing from the mine entrance acted as a barrier, preventing the killing frost from penetrating her walls. She was not fighting the storm, she was simply outside its reach. Her animals were calm. The goats chewed their cud in the stable, subterranean warmth, oblivious to the apocalypse raging just a few feet of stone away. The chickens roosted peacefully. Her small garden continued its slow, patient growth in the dim, constant climate of the cave. Her water, drawn from the deep cistern, was cool and clear, not frozen. Her firewood, stockpiled inside the mine's antechamber, was dry and plentiful. She had everything she needed. The deep winter routine she had established continued without interruption, a small, defiant island of order in a world consumed by chaos. Down in Prosperity Gulch, the storm was not a spectacle. It was a disaster. The town's confidence, built on conventional wisdom and clapboard houses, shattered within the first 24 hours. The wind, like a thief, found every crack and flaw in their construction. It tore shingles from roofs and rattled window panes until they burst, showering floors with ice and snow. The snow itself was a relentless enemy. It fell so fast and so heavy that it was impossible to keep doorways clear. It piled on rooftops until the beams groaned and, in some cases, cracked and gave way. The widow Jensen's porch roof collapsed with a sound like thunder, trapping her inside. The cold was the true killer. Families huddled around their fireplaces, burning through their woodpiles at an alarming rate. But much of their wood was stored in outdoor sheds, now buried under 10 feet of snow. What they had inside was quickly exhausted. The town's meeting hall, a symbol of their civic pride, suffered a massive crack in its foundation from the frost heave. The church bell, coated in a thick layer of ice, was silent. Livestock, caught in hastily built barns that offered little protection from the wind, began to freeze to death where they stood. The safe, ordered world of Prosperity Gulch was collapsing. The community, which had found such sport in mocking the woman who lived in a hole in the ground, was now trapped in flimsy, freezing boxes of their own making, their preparations and their pride proving utterly inadequate. The town was dying. On the third day of the blizzard, when the wind was a solid wall of sound, and the world outside was an undifferentiated blur of white, a new sound penetrated the defenses of Eleanor's homestead. It was a frantic, desperate banging on the heavy outer door of her cabin. Cinder erupted in a fury of barking, the sound echoing in the confined space. Eleanor's heart leaped into her throat. No animal would knock. It had to be a person. But who could possibly be out in this? How could they have survived? Grabbing the heavy iron poker from the hearth, she unbarred the door, bracing herself against the wind that tore at the opening. A figure, more a mound of snow and ice than a man, stumbled and fell across her threshold, collapsing onto the stone floor in a heap. He was gasping, his face a mask of frozen agony, his clothes stiff with ice. As she pushed the door shut against the storm's fury, she rolled him over. It was Mr. Gable, the merchant who had laughed at her, who had sold her the goats with a smirk, who had christened her the goat girl of the maw, lay half dead on her floor. His pride was gone, stripped away by the cold, leaving only the raw terror of a desperate man. He wasn't there for himself. Through chattering teeth and ragged breaths, he gasped out his story. His son, little Thomas, was sick. A fever had taken him 2 days ago, and now the house was as cold as a tomb. Their roof had a hole in it. Their firewood was gone, buried under a mountain of snow. His wife was trying to keep the boy warm with their own body heat, but it wasn't enough. The boy was fading. Gable looked at Eleanor, his eyes pleading. All the mockery, all the condescension was gone. He was just a father, terrified of losing his child. "Please," he whispered, the word a plume of frozen breath. "Anything. Firewood. A blanket. We were fools. I was a fool." Eleanor stood over him, the poker still in her hand. For a fleeting moment, she remembered the sting of his laughter, the whispers of the townspeople, the crushing loneliness of her first weeks on the mountain. It would be so easy to turn him out, to let the storm deliver the justice he deserved. The thought was as cold and sharp as an icicle. But then she looked at the man's face, ravaged not by pride, but by fear for his child. She saw not the mocker, but the father. The choice was not about him, it was about her. It was about the person she had become in this wilderness. She had not survived to become as cruel as the world that had cast her out. Without a word, she put down the poker. She helped Gable to a stool by the fire and wrapped her own heavy blanket around his shoulders. Then she turned and walked into the mine. She returned a moment later with a sled she had built from scavenged wood. She loaded it with dry, seasoned pine from her indoor stockpile, wood that was warm to the touch. She went to her goat pen and milked the nanny, filling a small pail with the rich, warm milk. She handed the pail to Gable. "This is for your boy," she said, her voice even. "It is warm. Get it to him quickly." Then she did something that defied all logic. She pulled on her heaviest coat, wrapped a scarf around her face, and picked up the rope for the sled. "I will help you," she said. To venture out into that storm was suicide. But a child was dying. She would not let him die because of his father's foolishness. She tied another rope around her own waist, securing the other end to a heavy iron piton she had driven deep into the rock wall of her cabin. It was a lifeline, a tether to her sanctuary. Together, they would face the storm. Mr. Gable watched her, his mind struggling to comprehend what was happening. He had come expecting at best a handful of sticks and a grudging curse. Instead, he was met with a competence and a generosity that felt utterly alien. He followed her into the mine to retrieve the sled, and the sight that met his eyes stopped him in his tracks. The warmth hit him first, a gentle, life-giving heat that seemed to radiate from the very rock around him. It was a stark, shocking contrast to the lethal cold of his own home. His eyes, accustomed to the howling whiteness of the blizzard, slowly adjusted to the lantern light. He saw the goats, healthy and calm in their clean pen. He saw the chickens, roosting peacefully. And then he saw the garden. A patch of vibrant, impossible green, growing in the heart of a frozen mountain. Kale and chard, alive and thriving in the dead of winter. He stared, his mouth agape. He could not reconcile this scene of quiet, organized abundance with the narrative he had so carefully crafted, the story of the mad, foolish girl living in a squalid hole. He turned to Eleanor, his face a mixture of awe and profound shame. The sled was piled high with firewood, more than he had seen in one place in weeks. The pail of milk in his hand was still warm. This was not survival. This was a thriving homestead, a fortress of life built on principles he couldn't even begin to understand. "My God," he whispered, the words catching in his throat. "We were wrong. Everyone. I called you a fool. We were the fools." Eleanor looked at him, her expression unreadable in the flickering light. There was no triumph in her eyes, no hint of, "I told you so." Her victory was not over him. It was over the mountain, over the winter, over despair itself. She offered no words of absolution or condemnation. Her response was simple, practical, and devastating in its grace. "The wood is heavy," she said, handing him the rope. "Your son is waiting." Her quiet grace was more humbling than any rebuke. She was not interested in his apology. She was interested in saving his son. In that moment, Gable understood that her strength was not just in her hands or her cleverness in building. It was in her character. She had endured their scorn, and in their moment of desperate need, she offered not vengeance, but help. She provided for the man who had mocked her, not because he deserved it, but because it was the right thing to do. She simply did what needed to be done. The journey back to town was a waking nightmare, a battle for every footstep. But with Eleanor's guidance and the lifeline rope, they made it. The warm goat's milk and a roaring fire from the dry pine broke the boys' fever. Gable's family was saved. When the blizzard finally broke 2 days later, the story of what had happened, of the impossible shelter in the maw, and the quiet woman who lived there, spread through the devastated town like wildfire. In the days following the great blizzard, a slow, humbled procession began to make its way up the mountain path to the Devil's Maw. It was not a path of mockery now, but one of desperate pilgrimage. Families whose homes were destroyed, whose livestock had frozen, whose food stores were gone, came seeking help. They found not a mad woman in a cave, but a quiet sovereign in her fortress. Eleanor met each of them with the same quiet grace she had shown Gable. She shared her food, her goat's milk, and the warmth of her fire. She offered shelter to the most desperate in the large, warm cavern of the mine. She did not gloat. She did not demand apologies. She simply gave what she had. The derisive nickname, Goat Girl of the Maw, was retired from the town's vocabulary. When her name was spoken now, it was with a tone of reverence. They started calling her the Rock Woman, or, more simply, Eleanor of the Mountain. The authority of men like Thomas Davies and Mr. Gable, built on wealth and conventional wisdom, had crumbled in the face of the storm. A new authority had risen, one built on resilience, ingenuity, and moral courage. The impact of Eleanor's methods rippled through Prosperity Gulch, fundamentally changing the community. When they began to rebuild, they did not just replace what was lost. They built differently. They started quarrying stone, building foundations deep into the earth. They designed homes with stone hearths at their core to act as thermal masses. They learned to build cellars and shelters that used the insulating properties of the ground itself. The men of the town, who had once pitied the lone woman with an axe, now came to her for advice on notching logs and mixing clay mortar. Her homestead became a landmark, a testament to a better way of living in that harsh land. Travelers passing through carried the story of the widow who had tamed the Devil's Maw, and her legend spread across the territory. The mine, once a symbol of failure and folly, became a symbol of hope and ingenuity. The settlement of Prosperity Gulch, saved from the brink of collapse by the very person it had cast out, became a stronger, wiser, and more resilient community. They had learned a hard lesson, that true prosperity was not dug from a silver mine, but built from stone, earth, and the quiet strength of the human spirit. Years later, Eleanor would stand at the door of her cabin, looking down at the valley. The town of Prosperity Gulch was nestled below, its rooftops solid, smoke curling from the sturdy stone chimneys. Her hair was streaked with gray, her hands permanently hardened by a life of labor, but her eyes were clear and calm. Cinder's descendant, a large black dog, lay at her feet. Her small herd of goats grazed peacefully in a paddock she had carved out of the mountainside. She had built more than a shelter. She had built a life, a legacy written not in words, but in stone and soil. She had been stripped of everything and given a worthless piece of land. But in that place of despair, she had found her true inheritance, an unshakable knowledge of her own strength, and the quiet peace of a life well lived.